Canada will respond, and everything is on the table.
They won't be tariffed without impact. They cannot be tariffed without consequences.
We need to target where it's going to impact Americans the most.
Nearly $6 billion in tourism revenue has vanished from the United States in a single year, not because of a natural disaster or a financial crisis, but because an entire nation of consumers has quietly turned away, and this decision is now reshaping the trade war between Canada and the United States in ways few anticipated. For 10 consecutive months, fewer Canadians have crossed the border by car, air, and rail. Entire tourism corridors in the United States are now facing shrinking demand, falling hotel occupancy, and declining convention bookings. Behind these numbers lies a deeper shift. This is no longer only about tariffs negotiated in government offices. This is now about households, retirees, and families in Canada using their spending power as an economic weapon inside the broader trade war. At the same time, this consumer backlash is no longer limited to travel. Canadian buyers are also rethinking their loyalty to American-made vehicles, sending warning signals through the automotive supply chain. What began with tariffs is evolving into a full-spectrum economic response driven by public sentiment. The United States is feeling the strain in its tourism sector, its retail industry, and now its auto market. Canada, meanwhile, is retaining billions in domestic spending. This is not merely a travel trend. It is a structural warning sign in the North American economy. And yet, the most destabilizing consequence of this shift has not fully surfaced, because what comes next could shock both markets and policymakers. For decades, Canada was treated as a stable and predictable economic partner, a market that would always absorb American goods, services, and political messaging without real consequence. That assumption is now breaking down inside the core sectors of the United States economy, and the financial damage is no longer theoretical. In border states that once depended heavily on Canadian consumers, the slowdown is rippling through payrolls, tax revenue, and municipal budgets. Retail corridors that catered almost exclusively to cross-border shoppers are reporting sustained declines in foot traffic. Regional airports that built their business models around predictable Canadian travel flows are now facing route reductions and operational cutbacks. These are not abstract statistics. These are structural disruptions spreading across local economies. The deeper problem for the United States is not the lost tourism dollars alone. It is the erosion of reliability. Once investors begin to treat Canadian demand as unstable rather than guaranteed, capital flows shift, credit risk rises, and long-term planning becomes far more conservative. Canada is no longer behaving like a passive partner. It is acting like a market that withdraws support when political trust collapses. And what is unfolding beneath these surface-level losses is far more dangerous than a downturn in travel, because the next phase, now spreading through the economy, is striking at the heart of American manufacturing itself in a way that few expected and even fewer are prepared to admit. For many years, policymakers in the United States believed that economic retaliation between nations would remain confined to government-led measures such as tariffs, sanctions, and regulatory barriers. What is now unfolding between the United States and Canada proves that assumption dangerously outdated. The most powerful weapon in this phase of the trade war is not being deployed in Washington or Ottawa. It is being deployed at kitchen tables, in retirement planning decisions, and inside household budgets across Canada. When millions of Canadian consumers alter even a fraction of their annual spending patterns, the macroeconomic impact compounds quickly. Tourism is only the most visible casualty because it registers immediately in hotel occupancy, airline load factors, restaurant revenue, and retail sales. But the deeper damage emerges when service sector contractions compound into labor market stress. Local governments in the United States begin to see declines in sales tax collection. Airport authorities face pressure on operating budgets. Small business owners delay hiring. These are the early signs of a broader confidence shock. In the past, Canadian demand was treated as a constant in economic forecasting models across the United States. Now it has become a variable of political risk. That shift alone changes the behavior of lenders, insurers, and institutional investors. When consumer confidence weakens across borders, capital formation follows. This is why the trade war between the United States and Canada is no longer a diplomatic storyline. It is rewriting the assumptions behind long-term investment. At the heart of this transformation lies a psychological break that few in Washington anticipated. Canadians are no longer acting as silent buyers willing to separate commerce from politics. Instead, purchasing decisions are now being framed as statements of national positioning. The logic is simple and increasingly widespread. Every dollar redirected away from the United States is a signal. Every domestic purchase inside Canada is a form of economic self-defense. This is precisely why the damage to the United States is extending beyond the travel sector into areas that once appeared untouchable. The service economy absorbed the first shock. The financial layer followed with revisions to revenue forecasts. Now, the consequences are beginning to move horizontally across industries in a way that transforms localized downturns into a systemic risk pattern. The scale of this shift matters because Canadian demand has historically functioned as one of the most reliable external support columns for the United States economy. When that column weakens, the stress on internal consumption increases. Domestic demand inside the United States is already under pressure from inflation, rising borrowing costs, and household debt. The removal of Canadian demand is not a standalone loss. It compounds existing vulnerabilities. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is that consumer-driven retaliation is far more resilient than formal trade restrictions. Tariffs can be negotiated away. Sanctions can be lifted through diplomacy. But once a population emotionally detaches from a market, the behavior can persist for years, even after the political trigger fades. And that is exactly why the United States economy now faces a second and far more destabilizing wave of pressure, one that strikes directly at the industrial core that has long been treated as politically protected. The trade war is now spreading into garages, dealerships, and assembly lines. Canadian consumers are quietly recalibrating their automotive preferences, and the implications for the United States manufacturing base are profound. For decades, American vehicle brands relied on Canada not only as a neighboring export market, but as an extension of their North American identity. That perception is now eroding. When Canadian buyers shift away from American-branded vehicles, the damage is not limited to showroom sales. The entire manufacturing ecosystem begins to feel the strain. Assembly plants in the United States operate on finely balanced volume targets. Even small deviations in export demand disrupt production planning, overtime schedules, and supplier contracts. The result is not immediate plant closure, but creeping operational instability. Tariffs play a central role in this transformation. As import costs fluctuate and retaliatory trade measures reshape pricing structures, Canadian consumers increasingly perceive American vehicles as politically and economically exposed purchases. In contrast, manufacturers that are perceived as neutral or internationally anchored benefit from a growing sense of insulation. This is how trade war psychology translates into market realignment. Inside the United States, the automotive sector carries enormous symbolic and political weight. It is tied to employment, union density, regional prosperity, and electoral calculations. Any sustained weakening of export sales to Canada therefore carries consequences far beyond quarterly earnings reports. It threatens community tax bases, pension systems, and local infrastructure funding. What makes this especially precarious is that Canada historically functioned as a stabilizer during downturns in other global markets. When demand softened elsewhere, Canadian buying often remained resilient. That stabilizing role is now fading. In its place emerges a new pattern in which political trust directly conditions consumer confidence. The message being sent through the Canadian market is unambiguous. The trade war is no longer perceived as a distant policy dispute. It is now understood as a direct relationship between words, tariffs, and economic consequences. Each new escalation compresses the psychological distance between political rhetoric and personal financial behavior. From the perspective of the United States, this creates an exposure curve that is difficult to hedge. Tourism losses could be partially offset through domestic demand stimulation. Automotive losses, however, strike at the transnational production network itself. Once those supply chains destabilize, the repair process becomes slow, expensive, and politically painful. The emerging reality is this. The United States is now absorbing consequences from the trade war, not only through policy channels, but through deeply rooted shifts in the purchasing identity of one of its closest economic partners. Canada is no longer behaving as a guaranteed market. It is acting like a strategic consumer bloc. And yet, what is beginning to emerge from financial data, shipping volumes, and dealership inventories suggests that the automotive front may only be the opening salvo of a much larger economic repositioning that reaches into energy, housing, and manufacturing finance itself. Because the next layer of this story does not unfold in showrooms or airports. It unfolds where long-term capital flows intersect with household confidence in a way that could redefine how the United States and Canada trade for an entire generation. And the most unsettling indicator of this deeper shift has only just appeared beneath the surface of the data, waiting to be fully exposed. For much of the United States population, the trade war with Canada once appeared to be a distant diplomatic matter, discussed in government chambers and economic briefings, but rarely felt in daily life. That psychological distance is now collapsing. The stress is moving directly into households whose incomes are tied to tourism, cross-border commerce, transportation, and export-dependent manufacturing. In cities that once thrived on steady Canadian demand, workers are absorbing the shock in subtle but deeply destabilizing ways. Fewer hotel bookings translate into fewer scheduled shifts. Restaurants reduce staffing hours rather than issuing sudden layoffs, creating income volatility that spreads anxiety across families. Retail workers experience lower commission earnings as foot traffic declines along once predictable cross-border shopping corridors. This form of economic pressure is especially corrosive because it does not unfold as a single visible crisis. Instead, it erodes stability over months. A family that once relied on stable seasonal overtime begins drawing on credit. A service worker delays medical care. A small business owner postpones equipment upgrades. These decisions compound into slower local economic circulation. Once these pressures converge, municipal finances begin to feel the strain. Lower sales tax collections feed into tighter city budgets. Infrastructure maintenance is delayed. Workforce training programs face funding pressure. The trade war thus migrates from international policy into local governance, altering public service quality in ways that residents may not immediately connect to foreign relations. The most vulnerable group in this transition is older workers nearing retirement who no longer possess the flexibility to retrain quickly. In hospitality-heavy regions, many of these workers have spent decades building income stability around seasonal demand linked to Canadian visitors. As that demand weakens, their path to retirement becomes less predictable, more fragile, and increasingly exposed to medical cost risk. This is where the true social cost of the trade war begins to surface. It is not captured fully by national employment statistics or quarterly earnings reports. It appears instead in household debt, delayed retirement, rising stress-related illness, and the erosion of long-term financial security. Canada's consumer pullback is therefore not just an economic data point. It is a slow-moving social shock moving through the American labor structure. And once these pressures reach this stage, reversing them becomes far more difficult than reversing a tariff line in a trade agreement. As job security weakens in trade-exposed sectors, consumer behavior inside the United States begins to shift in response. Household confidence declines when income stability becomes uncertain. Discretionary spending is the first to contract. Restaurant visits become less frequent. Vehicle replacement cycles lengthen. Home renovation projects are postponed. These behavioral adjustments then feed back into the same sectors already weakened by the loss of Canadian demand. This feedback loop is one of the most dangerous dynamics in macroeconomics. When external demand weakens and domestic consumption simultaneously contracts, the economy loses two engines at once. The trade war with Canada, therefore, does not strike the United States in isolation. It arrives on top of an already constrained consumer environment shaped by inflation fatigue, higher borrowing costs, and residual supply chain realignments. Credit conditions begin to tighten as lenders reassess risk exposures in tourism-heavy regions and export-dependent manufacturing belts. Small business access to financing becomes more restrictive. This further suppresses hiring and capital investment, reinforcing the downward consumption cycle. The generational dimension of this moment is also critical. Younger workers face reduced entry-level opportunities in hospitality and service industries. Middle-aged households confront income insecurity at the peak of their financial responsibilities. Older households confront retirement uncertainty. Each generation absorbs the trade war through a different vulnerability channel, but the cumulative effect is a broad-based erosion of confidence in future economic stability. The psychological imprint of this period may persist even if diplomatic tensions eventually ease. Economic memory, once formed, conditions future behavior. Households that experience prolonged exposure to instability tend to maintain higher precautionary savings and lower risk tolerance for years. This suppresses long-term growth potential even after policy conditions normalize. This is why the current phase of the trade war with Canada carries systemic risk far beyond the immediate tariff and tourism headlines. It is embedding caution into the spending behavior of millions of American households. Once that shift takes root, the pathway back to previous consumption patterns becomes narrow and fragile. What began as a geopolitical dispute has now evolved into a multi-layered economic stress system reaching deep into labor markets, family budgets, and municipal finance. The consequence is not a sharp crash, but a slow compression of opportunity. And yet, beneath this surface-level deterioration, another force is quietly forming that could transform this standoff into something far more structurally dangerous for the long-term balance between the United States and Canada. Because the next turning point does not emerge from consumer behavior or employment statistics. It emerges from strategic capital decisions that are now being made behind closed doors by institutions that rarely act on emotion, but always act on risk. And when those decisions become visible, the economic shockwave will look very different from anything seen so far. For generations, the United States built its North American economic strategy on a core assumption that rarely faced serious challenge. Canada would remain a politically steady, commercially open, and emotionally aligned partner, regardless of shifting rhetoric in Washington. That assumption is now being tested in real time, and the results are deeply unsettling for American planners. The trade war has exposed a vulnerability that tariffs alone were never designed to manage. Traditional trade disputes operate within predictable diplomatic loops. Retaliation follows escalation. Negotiation follows injury. This cycle assumes that markets will remain rational and consumers will remain neutral. What Washington is now confronting is a different form of resistance, one driven by national sentiment rather than formal policy. This type of reaction does not respond cleanly to incentives or concessions. Inside strategic planning circles, Canada has long been classified as a low-risk economic partner. That classification influenced decisions in manufacturing location, logistics routing, financial exposure, and energy integration. As Canadian consumer behavior shifts, that risk profile must now be recalculated. Even a modest reclassification of risk changes capital allocation models across transportation networks, industrial investment, and cross-border financing structures. This places the United States in a strategic bind. Responding too aggressively risks reinforcing the very consumer backlash that is destabilizing demand. Responding too passively risks signaling weakness at a moment when credibility already feels under pressure. The cost of miscalculation is therefore not confined to trade balances. It extends into alliance management and long-term regional stability. From a geopolitical standpoint, the United States now faces the uncomfortable reality that its closest economic neighbor is no longer operating on autopilot goodwill. Instead, every policy signal, every rhetorical escalation, and every tariff adjustment is now being interpreted through a lens of national dignity and consumer leverage. This significantly narrows Washington's strategic maneuvering space. The deeper danger is that this redefinition of Canada as a politically responsive market forces the United States to confront a question it has long postponed. What happens when proximity no longer guarantees loyalty? In a multipolar world, economic alignment increasingly depends on trust rather than geography. Canada's behavior suggests that even deeply integrated partners can realign their economic posture when political confidence erodes. This represents a strategic shock not only in trade policy, but in alliance psychology. The United States must now account for emotional variables in markets it once categorized as mechanically stable. That adjustment is complex, slow, and fraught with uncertainty. While Washington calibrates its response, the rest of the international system is already adjusting to the signals emerging from the North American trade conflict. Foreign governments, financial institutions, and multinational corporations observe this standoff not as an isolated bilateral dispute, but as a test case for how economic power is exercised in the current era. In Europe, transportation and tourism sectors are absorbing redirected Canadian demand with strategic interest. This is not viewed merely as a temporary travel boom, but as a potential structural reorientation of long-haul tourism flows. When demand migrates across continents, infrastructure investment follows. Airline capacity adjustments, airport expansion plans, and service sector hiring pipelines begin to shift accordingly. In manufacturing and logistics, international firms are closely studying Canada's evolving role as a semi-autonomous economic pole rather than a simple extension of the United States market. This affects site selection for future assembly plants, distribution hubs, and research facilities. A Canada that demonstrates strategic independence in consumer behavior sends a powerful signal to global investors seeking political risk diversification inside North America. Energy markets also quietly absorb the implications. Cross-border energy integration depends on regulatory harmony, public acceptance, and long-term political stability. As public sentiment becomes a material variable in trade alignment, the certainty that underpins multi-decade infrastructure investment weakens. This introduces a latent volatility premium into projects that once carried a near risk-free classification. From the perspective of emerging markets, the lesson is even more stark. If Canada, one of the most integrated partners of the United States, can recalibrate its consumer posture in response to political tension, then smaller economies possess far more leverage through collective demand behavior than previously assumed. This insight reshapes negotiations, sanction strategy, and diplomatic leverage across the global trade system. The trade war between the United States and Canada is therefore no longer interpreted merely as a North American problem. It is becoming a case study in how emotional economics interacts with structural trade power. Other nations are learning from it. Corporations are modeling scenarios based on it. Policy planners are extracting cautionary lessons from it. Yet, for all this international repositioning, the most consequential phase of this conflict has not yet been fully priced into global markets. What is currently visible reflects only the first layer of behavioral adaptation. The second layer, where capital formation itself begins to respond, is still largely forming beneath the surface. When that layer becomes visible, the narrative will no longer center on tourism slowdowns or consumer boycotts. It will center on investment withdrawals, project deferrals, and long-term strategic decoupling inside the North American core. And when that moment arrives, the scale of the economic shock will far exceed anything that travelers, retailers, or automakers have experienced so far. Because the final phase of this trade war will not be decided by shoppers or airlines, but by institutions whose decisions unfold silently until the damage is already locked in. Beyond tourism losses and shifting consumer sentiment, the most consequential transformation now unfolding lies in long-term capital allocation between Canada and the United States. For decades, investment flows moved back and forth across the border with minimal political friction. That era of quiet predictability is now being questioned inside boardrooms and financial institutions. When capital begins to reassess geographic risk, the timeline stretches beyond election cycles and tariff announcements. Infrastructure projects, manufacturing expansions, logistics hubs, and energy corridors are planned many years in advance. Once hesitation enters those calculations, delay becomes the default posture. The trade war, once treated as a temporary disturbance, is now being internalized as a structural variable. Canada's quiet repositioning as a more autonomous economic actor alters how multinational corporations evaluate North America as a production zone. A market that demonstrates consumer retaliation capacity and political sensitivity becomes strategically significant in its own right. This shifts bargaining power in ways that rarely appear in headlines but shape industrial geography for generations. For the United States, the danger is not only lost access to Canadian consumers, but a gradual erosion of its centrality within the North American investment narrative. When capital discovers alternative routes for certainty, those routes rarely reverse quickly. Even partial diversion of long-term investment reshapes employment patterns, tax bases, and regional development trajectories. At the same time, Canada faces its own strategic risk. Economic assertion strengthens domestic confidence, but prolonged decoupling also narrows near-term growth channels, especially in export-heavy sectors. The standoff therefore carries asymmetric costs that unfold on different timelines. The United States absorbs abrupt labor and revenue shocks. Canada absorbs gradual opportunity constraints that materialize later. This asymmetry makes resolution more complex. Short-term pain dominates political discourse in the United States. Long-term risk dominates corporate planning in Canada. Each side, therefore, perceives urgency through a different lens, complicating coordinated de-escalation. The true twist in this confrontation lies here. The trade war is no longer progressing through policy escalation alone. It is now migrating into the slower, quieter architecture of capital formation where decisions are rarely announced and reversals are rare. When this layer fully activates, the economic relationship between Canada and the United States may change not by decree, but by silent redesign. And the most unsettling signal is that the earliest indicators of this redesign have already begun to surface in places few outside the financial elite are watching, where the next phase of this confrontation may already be locked in motion. What began as a political confrontation built on tariffs has now evolved into a structural trade war that reaches far beyond government policy and deep into everyday economic life. The United States is no longer facing pressure only from negotiated tariffs. It is facing pressure from shifting consumer loyalty, redirected capital, and a growing recalculation of risk tied directly to its economic relationship with Canada. The true shock is not the decline in travel, nor the retreat from American products alone. The real shock is the quiet repositioning of long-term capital. When investment routes begin to change, reversals become rare, and the economic map of North America starts to redraw itself without dramatic announcements. This is the final stage of the trade war that few expected to arrive so quickly. For the United States, the cost is measured not only in lost revenue, but in weakened leverage, shrinking confidence, and slower long-term growth potential. For Canada, the strategy brings short-term economic insulation but introduces long-term trade uncertainty that cannot be ignored. Tariffs triggered the confrontation. But psychology, capital, and consumer identity are now driving its direction. So the defining question now stands before both nations and the wider global market. Is this a bold strategy by Canada that reshapes the trade war in its favor, or a risky fracture that ultimately destabilizes both Canada and the United States for years to come?